Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see many friends, comrades, fellow activists in the room. My name's Robin Gorner and I have the honour of chairing this session. I'm currently the lead of She Decides. And to kickstart the session, I want to invite Shanine Mashonga, who is a young leader with Africades, Vandire, sorry, I'm not saying it right, in Zimbabwe, and she was formerly one of the IAS Youth Ambassadors. And Shanine is just going to read a statement to us all. Please.
A pleasant evening to you all. As said by Robin, and thank you, Robin, for introducing me. I'm Shanine Mashonga from Zimbabwe, based in Africa, Jandiri. I'm currently a youth ambassador and also a youth advocate for young people living with HIV. So right now, I hope you're enjoying the conference as I am, because it's very informative and we'll take back some more information back to our different countries. So, well, right now, I'm going to read some statements to you, and please listen carefully. Okay. So to improve the situation of women living with HIV and AIDS throughout the world, we need encouragement and support for the development of self-help groups and networks. We also need the media to portray us realistically and not stigmatize us. We need accessible and affordable health care, conventional and complementary, and research into how the virus affects women. And also we need funding for services to lessen our isolation and meet our needs. All funds directed to us need to be supervised to make sure we get it. We need the right to be respected, supported in our choices about reproduction. This includes the right to have children and the right not to have children. We also need a recognition of the right of our children and orphans to be cared for and of the importance of our role as parents. We need education and training of healthcare providers and the community as large about human risks and our needs. Up-to-date, accurate information concerning all issues about women living with HIV and AIDS should be easily and freely available. We need recognition of the fundamental human rights of all women living with HIV and AIDS, particularly women in prison, drug users, and sex workers. These fundamental rights should include the right to housing, employment, and travel without restrictions. We need decision-making power and consultation on all levels of policy and programs affecting us. We need economic support for women living with HIV in developing countries to enable them to be self-sufficient and independent. So these are the sentences. I'll give it back to Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanine. That was a very powerful statement on behalf of women living with HIV. I just wonder, does everyone think that that statement was written for this conference in 2018? Sounds pretty up to date to me. No? Melbourne, maybe, 2014? Hands up if you think it was done for Melbourne. Durban? 2010? 2000 rather? Yep, you reckon it was for Durban? Anyone got any other idea about where it might have been written? 1991. First one? It wasn't the first one, it was actually 1992. So these are 10 of the original 12 statements from ICW. And so up here on the stage, you've got a clutch of us, 4 of us, who were here for the 92 conference. And I have with me the newsletters from the conference back in 92, and it is quite striking how much has changed and how much hasn't changed. We have in the newsletters statements such as circumcision is showing promise in avoiding HIV. Where is the research for women? Maybe the female condom is helpful. And some very interesting statements about ACT UP that had its first global meeting around the time of the conference in '92, the first time we met here in Amsterdam. And I think one of the really significant things about coming back together in Amsterdam is that Amsterdam was an activist conference. The Harvard Amsterdam conference in '92 was convened here because of some appalling human rights violations in the US and a decision by activists, doctors and others that we could not meet on American soil. And fast forward 26 years and we continue to see appalling US policies damaging our responses to HIV. So without saying more now about the history, I think many of us are now going to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the history of activism and where we need to go now and how we can inspire each other to continue along this road. But first of all, I've got the real pleasure of introducing a small video to you by Gabby Kent, and it's from the website We Rage On, which has just been launched and come live and looks at some of the history of activism. So let's take a quick look at that video. And thank you to Chris Maloris, the activist inside UNAIDS, who has convened this session and is doubling up as a very skilled technical presenter.
Not working.
Not yet.
Have you ever wondered what happened to the people you grew up with, fought with, cried with? The people you wanted to change the world with.
They don't care about people living with HIV and AIDS. Red ribbons are not enough. We demand more funding now.
It's time, in fact, for us to build a worldwide movement that can unite across international boundaries, that can have these demands met because of the force of people who are active and in the street and in the face of those who would block our access to treatment, education, prevention, information. Enough is enough. We say, act up, fight back, fight AIDS. Act up, fight back, fight AIDS.
I'm representing gay and lesbian organization in South Africa. I felt we have been used. I was really disgusted with the whole organization, and it was made for the only European or people who are rich, not for us.
This company says that if your T cells or whatever don't fit our trial design, we'll give you the drug under compassionate access. This company lies.
Is any of this familiar?
I remember John's voice, actually. Just hearing that voice, I haven't heard that for so long. He looked so young.
He was so young. There's Rich.
Yeah, that's me.
I remember just being unbelievably angry how everybody was using AIDS and HIV and people's deaths and people's lives to be racist, to be homophobic and to be sexist.
In our youth, HIV and AIDS was the clarion call for our generation, crystallising all of the prejudice and injustice in our society at that time. People were losing their jobs, their health, their lives. And so united in anger, we joined ACT UP, a global movement of activists, and set out, we thought, to change the world.
ACT UP is like my whole social network. If I didn't have it, I'd probably be like frustrated and married still or something.
We were rebels with a cause, fighting injustice, and sometimes our friends along the way.
Power. We have power when we're united. We don't have power when we're fighting each other. And if we can't accept different viewpoints, then we're as bad as the enemy.
I was walking down Old Compton Street just after I'd taken my job at Terence Higgins Trust and suddenly heard this voice across the street shouting out, "You fucking traitor."
25 years on, who have we become?
You know, there are times when you come out of a meeting with managers where you remember the person that you are, the activist inside you, who would go, fuck off.
Who survived and who didn't?
Let us accept what they're going to put into our bodies and what our bodies can give back to them for their studies.
Well, it's really tough watching that.
Yeah.
And did our activism change anything at all?
Why is it so difficult for us to implement PrEP? Why is it that our leading community-based organisations have been caught on the hop?
Knowing what you know now, what would you want to say to your 20-something self?
I look back at some of the stuff we did and I put my head in my hands and think, what the fuck were we doing?
Turning 50, as well as Rich being so sick, there was a sort of time for me to take a bit of a step back and to think, what is it that I want to do? What is it? How can I impact still?
And it's hard to stay angry because sometimes I just feel upset and I'm not angry anymore. But most of the time, I'm angry. It's enough.
Rage On is a film about growing up, about friendships and fallouts, protests and politics, loves and losses. From London to Berlin to Cape Town, we go in search of those we crossed paths with 25 years ago to see how our activism has shaped who we are today. The journey is just beginning. Join us.
Thank you very much, Gabby and Will, for your work on We Rage On. I think that's a very poignant and pointed way to begin this session. Eric, you were here in '92 at the Amsterdam conference, but actually you were working in HIV for almost a decade before that, and one of the founding members of ACT UP New York. You've also worked in UNAIDS. You've also worked at GMHC, but you spent a huge amount of time with ACT UP, focusing on the committees on housing, HIV, TB, co-infection, and global AIDS issues. And I believe you were one of the founding members of Housing Works as well. So tell us a little bit about looking back to that long history of activism. What do you think some of the lessons are for us in terms of what happened at the conference in '92 and how we might rekindle things going forward?
Well, I think the Amsterdam conference was really informative for me and led a lot of the work that I did going forward in the global arena with regards to access to treatment. We had been working really hard in the U.S. to force the U.S. government to develop HIV medications. We'd worked to try to get a safety net established in the United States so people could have housing and food stamps and access to Medicaid cards so they could get health care even if they were really poor and didn't have health insurance. And then we started coming to international conferences to, share our knowledge, but also to try to reach out to force governments and multinational organizations to provide services and human rights and treatments to people in the developing world. So we knew about, the two epidemics, the rich northern epidemic where people like myself had access to treatments for opportunistic infections and the early HIV meds, and I had been living with symptoms for a decade when I came to the Amsterdam conference. I became symptomatic in 1981 when it was called GRID, and I was still alive 10 years after that point, and people in Africa were dying in a year or 18 months after diagnosis. But I was not aware for just how severe the difference was, and we had been meeting with activists in New York with Jonathan Mann and the Community Liaison Committee and had put in place a global town hall to talk about how activism could be coordinated globally and how we could share information and try to work together to try to expand treatment. And when the first meeting of the activists were called, organized by ACT UP Amsterdam, I was appalled. I mean, there were people there who had gotten scholarships from the developing world, from foundations and funders and bilateral government arrangements, and literally got on planes with horrible herpes outbreaks covering their face and active thrush so bad they couldn't swallow or eat, and KS and wasting syndrome. And there were actually some people that got on a plane to come here with PCP. They got on a plane with pneumonia. They were so desperate to try to reach something to save their lives that they came to a conference with active pneumonia. And so a few of us got pissed off. We went to the community liaison office. We talked to Jonathan Mann. We told him the situation. We said, look, you need a PWA lounge. It's got to have cots for the frail to be able to rest. It's got to have hot meals, because there's lots of people who don't have money for food here. And you've got to have doctors and nurses here to see people. And even more to the point, we think there's some people with active pneumonia. You got to get them in a hospital. And Jonathan agreed. And so that started the whole kind of process of PWA lounges at conferences, and a lot of people didn't have money for registration, so we pushed for we pushed for free registrations. We got discount registrations, but it really inspired me to realize that I needed to change my attention from the U.S. epidemic to the global epidemic, to try to get access to treatment in the developing world. For God's sakes, opportunistic infections drugs to treat things like thrush and herpes and prophylaxis against pneumonia are dirt cheap. Literally those pills are like pennies, if maybe $1. And the fact that we didn't have those drugs here in the developing world just enraged me. And so that focused my next probably 15 years of work.
So I'm going to turn briefly then to Kate. I think we'll have a bit of a dialogue amongst us all, and obviously amongst people in the room. So you've given us some of the starting points of what was going on. Kate, you were, as we saw last night, one of the founding members of the ICW, and it's lovely to see so many of those co-founding members of the ICW here in this room and brought back together again here in Amsterdam. What do you think, looking at the long history? What have you learned? What's the same and what's changed as a result of the activism that's happened by people like you and Eric over the last 26 years or longer?
Thanks, Robin.
Oh, I didn't say who you were, sorry. Kate is the head of the Community Rights and Gender Department at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria, and before that she was the head of the Civil Society Unit at UNAIDS, and as I said, she co-founded ICW and also co-founded Positively Women for women living with HIV in the UK in the mid-1980s.
Thanks again. So yeah, what's changed and what hasn't changed and what's still the same? So just looking at that film for me, that film clip was quite an experience. There were two close friends of mine, John Campbell and John Mordaunt, the two Johns, who I was at both their funerals. I spoke at John Campbell's funeral, and it's been a while. It's been a while since I've been to the funeral of a colleague of mine who's living with HIV. And for me, that's one of the most profound changes in my experience since I was diagnosed, which was the January 1987, so it's a while ago now. And that whole period, up in really until 1996, I'd say, when we hit the conference in Vancouver, during that period, we all of us just lost so many friends and colleagues. And it was a period where it was such a strange period because I was a reluctant activist. I didn't particularly, it wasn't something that I fell into comfortably. I've never enjoyed being in public, speaking in public, but I was forced to do it because we had no choice. There was no one speaking up for us. And I think that energy that we had in those early days, from pure, we were all forced in it because there was nothing else. There was no one there to, to be there and be saying things for us. So there was an energy that has shifted, I think, and I think we'll talk about that a bit later. What else has changed? So what stayed the same, I think, are many of the issues. And as Robin said, and as our colleague read out earlier, the ICW statements that a number of us, 56 of us, crafted before the Amsterdam AIDS conference. As you'll have seen, those of you who were at the beginning, there's so much that hasn't changed in terms of what we need to do, what needs to shift in terms of stigma and discrimination, in terms of human rights, in terms of some of the basic issues around sexual and reproductive health and rights, women's status in society. And it's all of these elements that, despite the more than 30 years of us collectively as communities pushing for change, we haven't made the progress that we need to make. We've made fantastic progress around treatment access, but not nearly enough. As I said, I'm not going on a regular basis every week, every month to funerals, and yet there are people who are less fortunate than me and many others in the room who still don't have access. So it's changed, but it's changed for some of us. It has not changed for everyone, even that very, very basic and fundamental issue of access to treatment. And I think what has tended to happen is that there has been that complacency that's set in. We tend to forget some of that, I think. We forget, what it was like in those early days because some of us are not living it anymore. For me, my activism has it's evolved in an interesting way. I've taken an interesting path, I think. And I'm looking at Chris Malores because we both chose a different route of activism. We both ended up as international bureaucrats, trying to kick down the walls from within and trying to make influence from the inside. It's not always an easy way to do it, but I think what we've learned is that what I've learned is that there are so many different paths we can take and different facets of what activism can and should be about. What's interesting, I'll stop in a minute. What's interesting looking back, because I've also over the last few years been, there was How to Survive a Plague, there was 120 beats per minute, there's this. What I'm very much aware of is that ACT UP did a brilliant job of documenting what was taking place, and what they were doing across the world made a huge difference. But there are a lot of other quieter forms of activism that were taking place too, that were equally effective, I think, that haven't been documented in the same way. And so it's interesting when I'm looking and seeing, what we're reflecting back on, there's a lot of stuff that's missing as well. And that's why I think it is really important that collectively before it's too late, we really try and capture the broad history of our movements moving forward. Because I think we have so much to learn from what's gone before as we try and think and reconceptualize what it is and what we need to do moving forward.
Thank you, Kate. So we've heard now from two activists from a peer perspective who've turned into bureaucrats, and we're looking at one in the audience. Vuyiseka Debula Majola, similar route, only from activist to academic, diagnosed in 2001, according to your bio, and referred in the book A to Z of Amazing South African Women as a heroine of our times, since she's really beaten all the odds and is working actively to improve the situation. Vuyiseka is currently the new director of Stellenbosch University's Africa Centre for HIV/AIDS Management, and she's been a lecturer there for 2 years. But in addition to that, she has a proud background as the Secretary General of the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, and despite her academic role, she's a fierce and active activist up to this day. Now, listening to Kate's story, how much of that resonates with South Africa? I mean, is it the same story, or is the loss more raw and real still? And what do you think activism has and is achieving in your country and in the region?
So in 92, I was trying to reflect, where was I, what was happening in 92? As you know, I come from a country that has endured quite a lot of oppression from different regimes. 92 was a year for South Africa where, in fact, those who were in exile and those who were in South Africa were busy negotiating for the release of our leaders who were banned or some were in prison. And that very same year also, we had the first meeting ever to discuss about what would happen if we were to be liberated tomorrow around access to healthcare. And HIV was on the agenda. And of course, I was not in the room. And I hear that some of the challenges in that meeting were the fact that people with HIV at that time, although they were invited in the room, but they were not the decision makers in the discussion. We were only there for visibility and symbolism. In fact, we only needed to just tell our stories and get out of the room. And the narrative at the time was, please do not distract us from the real political issues and talk about gay rights and HIV. You are wasting our time. We are here talking about real politics, meaning taking back our country. And so coming back to, 92 and hearing the statement today and thinking where we were in terms of HIV in South Africa, it doesn't mean that HIV wasn't there. I mean, my comrades like Sean Mellows were there in 92. And I'm glad today that Sean, amongst other comrades, are still alive. Very few of the comrades who were there in 92 in that meeting in South Africa are alive, including Prudence Mabele and many other women who were involved. So I came very, very late in the struggle in terms of HIV. I was diagnosed in 2001. In 2001, in South Africa, HIV was a death sentence. And it was a death sentence because you were diagnosed with a disease, and because you have no money to buy medicines, therefore you're going to die because the state had no provisions for people who were poor, except if you had money. And we had to take on big powers, including our own democratically elected government. Imagine, we just came out of liberation. Here are young people living with HIV challenging a legitimate government. It was not an easy process and continues not to be today, because it's not like we're challenging a Trump administration, So we are challenging a government that we say it is a legitimately elected government, but chooses policies that are contrary to supporting or to deliver healthcare to its own citizens. So that for me struck me as something that really then said for me in the very early ages that, you know what, sometimes we can't be naive. Even our own leaders can dump you, especially if you have a disease that's highly moralized, if you have a disease where people think you deserve the disease you have and therefore go and find your own solutions. So I come from that generation where we had nothing to lose. I've seen death. In fact, I knew how I was going to die. I've seen how other people who had my disease were going to die. It was worse for women because we were told that HIV is for gay men. And so we couldn't locate ourselves as women. So where do we get the disease? We don't sleep with gay men. We sleep with heterosexual men. Where do we get the disease? And so where do we belong in the spectrum, in the conversations, if this is a disease for gay men? And it forced our own governments to change the narrative, even our communities to change the narrative that actually in Africa, the disease manifested differently. And yes, in the beginning, the narrative was a gay narrative, but it manifested differently, and they needed to acknowledge that HIV lives in every household. And to fight, so we had to take on the state using very confrontational tools, including using our own constitution in challenging the state. which is something I have never before TAC, I have never had to take on government in the way that I had to take on a government that I believed in. I mean, it was easy to channel my anger towards an apartheid government because it was an illegitimate government. It wasn't easy for an ANC government. But fast tracking to today, if you look back to 2001, where we saw a lot of deaths, many people could not even make it to 2003 when we started to roll out ARVs after a long period of fighting the state and drug companies. Many people today, as much as we used to see so many deaths in 2001, we are now back to that, Kate. We are seeing deaths today because people living with HIV have disengaged from healthcare. And when we told health providers and the state that there's something going wrong, what killed Prudence? What killed Vuyani Jacobs? What many, I can name a lot of people that I marched with who died when we had ART. And the issue of fatigue, disengagement is dismissed as not a real issue. And it's not just dismissed because it's people feel like, are you talking about loss? No, I'm not talking about loss to follow up. I know what that means. I'm talking about people who actually we have become, the health program has become a pill-driven program. It's not a human-driven program. And we are humans. And once it becomes a pill-driven program, obviously I'm going to disengage because I don't want to just talk about how I'm taking my pills. I want to talk about how life is living with menopause. I didn't know I was going to live up to 40 years. I now have 2 children. I have to work. I have to juggle all these things. I didn't even know that I was going to live up to a point where I have a job. I didn't even know I was going to have an 11-year-old daughter who's asking me complicated things about being an adolescent. Where do I go to ask these questions? Because I'm stuck in my head. I thought I was going to die. So it's complicated. And unfortunately, it is not just an issue of taking the pill. And I apologize, I have verbal diarrhea. It's self-diagnosed. But I feel today we are taken for granted because I think some of the things that is really weighing out of the AIDS activism is really taking evidence and owning evidence as our own generated evidence. I think we rely a lot on others these days. I mean, if people with HIV did not sit down and say, what do we want and how do we want it, where is the evidence and how do we get that evidence through our own stories, but also using science, today I think you are likely to find movements that do that intentionally. We've become, I mean, we rely on UNAIDS to tell us 1999 is the best thing. And then we don't even question how did you get there? How did you calculate that? Which methodologies did you use? Not that I'm saying it's wrong, but you have a three-legged, you are selling us a three-legged chair. Who's going to come and test if they don't know? Where is the fourth chair? Knowledge, awareness that deals with issues around who tells people to go and access healthcare where and how do they access those services. So we need a fourth 90. It's that fourth 90 that will make sure that people don't disengage because we will be connected to each other through support groups, which have been eradicated, by the way. The support groups where we met, we used to do education. How many countries do have support groups today? So I think we need to go back to some of those basics, and basically that's why I've tended to become those two. I'm living in those two worlds, being an activist, which sometimes I allow myself to be mad. But in academia, I'm not allowed to be mad. I'm allowed to just get the jargon right, speak the right language to the right people. So I live with this paranoia that tomorrow I'm that, and today I'm that. And I allow myself to wear those hats sometimes, both. And it's okay that we need some of us to move into spaces where we can generate that data for ourselves. We can be part of people who claim that they know what's happening on the streets, while they don't know by just looking at us from an armchair, that we know because we are in the streets as much as we are inside academia.
Thank you, Vuyiseka. I'm going to turn now... to Diego Luis Grajales.
Grajales, yeah.
Grajales, I'm saying it right. So, Vuyaseka was 14 at the time of the first Amsterdam conference, we think. And I love the fact that, Diego, your bio begins with the fact that you went through a time of rebellion during your teen years, when you dropped out of school and started abusing substances, and that since then you've been an educator with the Collaborative Network of Persons Living with HIV, CNET. You've also been involved with the Pan American Social Marketing Organization, working with key populations, in particular MSM and female sex workers. And you've got involved through your work in Belize with J plus LAC, GMP plus, Y plus. It would be great to hear from you a little bit more about your perspectives on mobilizing young people with HIV in the Latin America region and what you think the current requirements of activism are and the opportunities.
Repeat that?
Well, the current demands of activism and the opportunities.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank our older activists for all the great work that you guys did for us to pave the way so that we can have access to the advances in science and advancements in human rights that in most of our countries we can benefit of. Although in some countries we don't have that yet. For example, in my country, homosexuality was illegal until 2016, but now we are advancing slowly with activism. Yeah, my perspectives on activism, I think that as we young persons, we are starting to mobilize. We are no longer silent. We speak out our voices. We are occupying spaces where key decision-making and players are there. Putting our recommendations, making sure that everything is set there. So we're no longer, and we are mobilizing our community at the ground level. For example, there is a slide right there. It's called Dear HIV, where young persons from across the Latin American region would put their very brief and precise statements as how they view their HIV status from a personal perspective, with key message that would help other young persons across the region to identify that I am not the only one mobilizing, and this has been really successful, especially for and I must commend the Latin American Network of Young Persons with HIV, JMASLAC, and all of this is done without any funding. Young persons mobilizing without any funding, making sure that their voices are heard in the regional and international scene. So probably next. Yeah, so here's some of our key messages that we do for World AIDS Day and other spaces to put out the statements that we want people to hear, the issues that are affecting us in our country. And this is another slide where it was a little bird told me, and you would put brief facts on the realities of each country. And so each young persons from across the region were mobilizing and posting on social media. We as young persons which is why I must commend the older folks. How did they manage to mobilize at a time when there was not much internet connection? I mean, internet only arrived Belize in 2000, so wow, that's impressive. So it's really amazing the tools that we had. And I remember I spoke to an older activist from Mexico, and he was telling me, y'all need to step up your games. I mean, you have all these tools now. You must start mobilize. And I was like, yeah, we are. And we are going there. I mean, we are young persons. We live in a time where we have access to information. We have access to the tools. We have access to everything. And our messages reach our decision makers only by at such and such president, at such and such country, and these messages get read, and we are moving forward. We are stepping up our game through social media, because that's basically our greatest tool that we have right now. Everyone listens to social media, and these spaces where young persons are representing now is not tokenistic spaces, because now they are speaking for the whole globe. They're sitting there and say, in Africa this is happening, in Latin America, and these are the things that need to be targeted. These are the issues that need to be dealt with, and this is how you do it. And I invite decision makers here to engage young persons at the creation of policy to the implementation all the way through, because that's the only way we'll truly reach the affected communities.
Thank you, Diego. So we're going to get younger and younger as we go along this panel, and going back to Shanine now. And I think what's really interesting is to hear this thread of the activism and the different ways in which we're interpreting and learning from each other. Shanine, tell us from your perspective. And what I didn't say when I introduced you before is that you're 21 and you lost both your parents to HIV. Is that correct? And that so you've been working with Zvandiri as a community adolescent treatment supporter, as well as in other roles. So tell us a little bit about how the youth mobilisation is going in Zimbabwe and what activism that you're doing is informed by some of these stories that you're hearing.
All right. Thank you, Robin. And once again, thank you so much, activists who were there past 92. I was probably not born, and I don't know if the planning arrangements were made yet. But I'm glad that I'm here. So, for the correction, I'm actually 23, turning 23 in September. So in Zimbabwe, things were going hectic behind the years, but we're glad that there were more advocates, people who were rising up, and we thank them and salute them. So right now, the activists or the things we are doing right now in the perspective of what I'm doing and where I work in Africa Jandiri, there are programs which have aroused, and what we focus on was more on the differentiated service delivery, whereby we involve adolescents and young people, and we know that they are a diverse group and not the same, and they need services. To access these services, we need to hear their voices and also to have implementing cadres and also to help them in those things. And as we know that these young peers, they are diverse and they are more of a certain that they are damaged with different things due to psychological perspective and within their backgrounds, which includes the mental health perspective and also stigma and also early child marriages. I will mention a few, but it was said before by Diego that it is important that we use interventions of social media because those platforms are there to at the access of the young people out there. Young people will use those platforms of social media. As you go around, you may see that everyone has a phone, and maybe on WhatsApp and also on Facebook. They may not have the average of accessing those things, but due to using a small text message of an SMS, it is a good idea. And also using the peer-led interactions, whereby we should also involve young people. And I'm also excited that and glad that it has evolved that before, young people, we were not heard, and also our voices were being suppressed. But right now it is evolving, and it is shown that those who were advocating and also the activists who were advocating for the young people's voice to be heard, it is also changing and also evolving. So more involvement of young people is needed because they give an example or to elaborate and empower other young people out there, especially in involving other key populations, LGBTQIs, who their voices are also being suppressed. Back then in Zimbabwe, we have community mobilizations whereby we engage other cadres and also other organizations whereby they do perspective work in reaching out to different key populations, and by supporting these, they advocate for the importance of having all these. So as I was saying that HIV has been a deadly disease behind them, but we should also understand and know that right now we are going to reach to the 2030. What are we going to do? What is our plan? So I'm saying that let's include the inclusion of peer-led activism and also advise young people out there to be more empowered and also to raise their voices to say out loud what they want. I have some quotes of what was said before that of the activism in Amsterdam, that just because you don't see, it doesn't mean it's not there. Just because we don't notice all these things are roaming around, like it is being said that we need SRH services, it is being said that medicines are scarce in this world, and it is being advocated that we need all those things. But the funding, we know that financial perspectives, it is the somehow lagging us behind, but still we need to see what is in front of us. And repeating again, just because we can see it doesn't mean it's not there. It is right in front of us. So let's make a move and also empower people to change the things, and also so that when we reach the 2020 movement, we will applaud of our work. And also quoting some of the quotes for Spin in 1992, he said that AIDS is a behavioral disease and it is a multifactorial brought on by several simultaneous strains in the immune system. Drugs, pharmaceutical and recreational, and sexual transmitted disease. There's multiple viral infections. So we need to see all of these things, and also to elaborate and also engage peer-led activism, because they are the ones, they know each other and understand each other, and mostly they are the ones affected by the things they faced before, and they also have a friendly way of communicating and also a powerful voice that if they stand up, they may be heard and also change everything. So I have not much to say, but I think that.
Thank you very much, Shanine. So let's go back as our last speaker to Will Nutland, whose film with Gabby began our session. Will was with ACT UP Norwich in 92, and then as you saw in the film, he became a traitor and moved to Terence Higgins Trust. I believe that was my fault as I recruited him. And since that time, he's taken a similar route to Vuyiseka in terms of moving between activism and academia. 2008, Doctor in Public Health at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and then co-founded the Prepster movement and We Rage On, as you've just seen. And I think one of the themes that I've heard coming from all the speakers really that resonates for me is that point about nothing about us without us. That was one of the early slogans of the PWA movement, wasn't it? And as we listen to you as young activists, at that point about youth engagement and the numbers of young people here in the conference, it's a very similar energy as we've heard. The other point that I heard coming through is about smart activism and quiet activism. So the different ways in which people practice activism. And Kate, you made the point very well about the fact that some groups have documented what they do more than others. Will, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you see smart activism and what your own trajectory tells you about that?
Sure, thank you, Robin. So firstly, I want to say in the beginning of the film, there is a young South African guy from an LGBT group, and all we know about him is that he's called Cecil. And Gabby's over there with her camera, Gabby and I have been trying to track down Cecil for years. So if you recognize Cecil from the footage, please come and grab us at the end, because we would really love to find out what happened to his story. So Kate said something that really resonated for me about quiet activism and smart activism. And actually, Robin, I think academia can be activism. So let's not forget that those of us who move into the academic field can continue activism as we go along. It's been fascinating preparing to come to this conference, particularly because Gabby and I have been working on this film. And for one sense, I think everything's changed. On another sense, little has changed. And I think if we cast our minds back to 1992 and see what all the successes we've seen in treatment and prevention now, we would have been out dancing in the streets. I don't think any of us could have imagined the point we're at now when we've got, by taking, for those of us who are HIV negative, taking a single pill every day can stop us from getting HIV. I don't think any of us could have imagined that taking a small handful of pills could keep those of us who are living with HIV not only healthy, but stop us from passing on HIV. And the whole amazing U=U movement is testimony to that. So I think we would have been out dancing in the street and celebrating and being amazingly proud if we were able to cast our minds forward. But I think also, when I look back, I think we would have also been hanging our heads in shame about the absolute appalling nature of some of the inequalities of those successes we're seeing. If you were paying attention towards the end of the video, there's one very small clip that was filmed just downstairs outside of the main entrance to the Rye Conference Centre in 1992. And there are about 1,000 of us bashing on the doors of the main conference centre trying to get in. And the chant we're saying is no more bullshit, open the borders now. And if you're at Monday's march, you would have heard Kelezzo getting the whole crowd to make that chant. And that chant wasn't just about trying to get those of us who were unregistered into the conference. That chant was also a microcosm of a bigger thing that was going on. Robin's mentioned it. The movement of the conference from Boston here to Amsterdam, and one of our ACT UP California, ACT UP San Francisco, or Golden Gate, I can't remember which one was the bad one and which one was the good one, but he was one of the good guys. Thomas from San Francisco flew out to the conference and very publicly challenged George Bush, arrest me when I come back to California. I'm not allowed to come back in, arrest me. I publicly challenge you in front of people like Elizabeth Taylor at his side. Arrest me if you need to. And that was a huge theme about borders around the conference. And I think we've moved massively ahead in that context. But Robin has also just talked about the huge human rights violations of the United States. Now we are living in a world where the President of the United States finds it acceptable to throw the children and the babies of migrants into cages, where there's a Muslim travel ban, where LGBT rights are being violated, where people who are using drugs are being violated. And yet we're thinking about taking this conference back there in 2 years? Yeah, Thomas is there. So I think if anything I'm learning from looking back in time is actually we're making the same fucking mistakes. And I want to make a call to IAS. Do not go back to Trump's country. No IAS in 2020 in Trump's America. And we should be standing really strong and really tall and telling everyone at IAS that we will not come and we will take our meetings somewhere else, and fuck you, Trump, and all of the crap that comes with you. So now I've got the fire back in my belly. Thank you, Robin. What should we be doing? What's smart activism? So I haven't stopped being an activist since 1992. In fact, I've been telling people this week, I fell in activist love in 1992. I was a young queer guy who was pulled from the east of England. 12 of us from Norwich came over and spent about 10 days over here. It was my first time I'd interacted with people like Eric and Alden and Andy Villers and Jane and a whole bunch of fucking amazing people from across the States. People like Tanner, Karina from ACT UP Amsterdam. And we had the most amazing week of organizing, protesting, partying, and fucking. I had my first three-way in a squat in Amsterdam that weekend, and it was the best part of my sex life to that point. And so I'm just pulling some kind of parallels between 120 BPM and the film. So if you've seen that, for me, it was a real sense of realism. But I had my falling in love with activism, and I've followed that trajectory ever since. So I've moved up. I'm really glad Robin hired me at Terence Higgins Trust. It really gave me a further homing in and refining of my activism. But I've spent the last 4 or 5 years really pushing for issues around PrEP activism. And I think within PrEP activism, one of the things I've learned is that whilst whilst there is a place for the activism that we've traditionally done, whilst there is a place for street activism, whilst there is a place for protest, whilst there is a place for what I call more traditional activism, I think there's now also a place that sits along in parallel with this, what I call activism 2.0. And that's smart activism that means that we need to do things like, if NHS England will not provide PrEP for free for those of us who want it, then as well as pushing our health system and our government and our bureaucracies to make PrEP available, we also will set up our own underground buying schemes. We will find ways of providing PrEP for the thousands of people in the UK who need it but cannot get it because it's too expensive, because of Gilead's pricing policy, and because of the laziness of the bureaucracies in our NHS. So I'm not for one moment saying that the old style street activism is not relevant, but I think Kate is quite right. There are many forms of activism, and some of that activism involves letter writing, cajoling, writing to our members of parliament, and it also means the slow slog of writing policy documents and lobbying and setting up buyers networks and lobbying Gilead and doing all of these things in a strategic, thought-through way, and then going out and demonstrating the fuck on the street every single time we need to.
Thank you, Will. Well, some fantastic reflections from all of the panel. I think I'd like to open this up to the floor because I can see in the audience a huge number of eminent older and younger activists from around the world. And I really appreciated your reflections there on some of the ingredients of activism. You're not the first person at this conference to tell me that one of their best memories of 92 was their first threesome. So there must have been something in the water. But also I think, like the film 120 BPM tells us, some of the magical ingredients of activism have been the partying as well as the politics, the friendship, the community, and that really came through very strongly in some of the reflections. So does anybody in the audience have some comments or questions? Please, at the mic there. And do direct it if it is to anyone in particular, otherwise we'd love to hear from all of you.
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful to have people who've been around for over 26 years and have been involved in the response, but what I really see is a huge sea of gap between Jago, the young woman, and the four of the people, in the sense that we are a new generation of people who are actually willing to take a lot of the risk that some people that feel that there are certain strands of activism that should be advanced. A lot of us who are much younger are looking at UHC instead of responding to an epidemic. We're looking at addressing intersectional issues that really precipitate the epidemic. Patriarchy, we're looking at poverty, we're looking at environmental justice, how this makes people vulnerable to HIV and getting poor health. And that's where we need to take the dialogue to. This is a room that is supposed to attract a lot of people that are from the community doing badass activism. But where is the trans people on that panel? I'm not assuming anyone who is doing sex work, but we need to hear those voices. People on the fringe. And while we are great at what we do, we need to be very reflexive as a movement and as a people. I'm much younger than a lot of you, but I still think the gap that exists between older activists and younger activists needs to be mitigated. And this is where a little bit of stepping back and saying, we're bringing the younger people on board. And not only to read essays or tell us a few things, but really having them at the front and center to be leading this epidemic. Because we are the people that are going to live for the next 70, 60, 50 years, and some of our issues are very, very new and modern. We are not even talking about support groups in person. We're talking about online meetings and all these different ways of organizing and reacting to, for example, VIV DTG and all these issues. So I think we need to have this dialogue going on, and this is not to bash the incredible work you all do. I love it. I have enormous respect for Vuiseka, enormous respect for her, but I think we need a lot of younger people be given the platform to be shaping this conversation. And I hope, while this is not a comfortable comment to make, we all reflect on it while we go on. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent point. Does anyone else want to make a comment from the floor? Please. Please go ahead.
If I may, I'd like to actually respond to and support what you're saying. A little bit of a different historical perspective, and I want to try to unpick the comment you were making about this becoming a pill-driven response to the epidemic. I think Eric and other people made really great references to how broad and varied. The responses were prior to 1996 in combination therapy. I was working at Project Inform in San Francisco. It was one of the first treatment information and advocacy organizations. And we were, before internet, actually trying to get treatment information to people. And I think it's very important to understand that we had been involved in a really wide-ranging set of activities. Sort of the 80s, 90s version of intersectionality. And we were looking at immune restoration. We were looking at combination responses, complementary therapies, and I think the examples you were giving about housing works and other activities to really deal with people's poverty and all of that. That was all going on. 1996 came, and even though Project Inform had by this point been involved in all of the decision-making at the governmental level, all of that research and all of that activism focused on how to make combination therapy work. And our message from the treatment advocates was, people, take this information to your doctor and you can live. And we participated in that whole focusing on the medical response. By this time, too, many of us had already died. Project Inform had very limited resources, and I think it would help us if we understood our own role in that process, because we dumbed down the messages. The movement really changed after 1996 and became much simpler. I could go on and on about that, but I think it's important to understand that what you're saying is as valid as what we were saying then. It's almost exactly the same. Make the connections. Join with other people. Don't just look at a simple solution, but look at a broad solution and take responsibility for both the successes and the mistakes that we've made. Because we do, as Will says, keep making the same fucking mistakes and not owning it. So thanks to the youth who are here pushing for that. There are other people here, I'm sure you see the nodding of heads. So we're in the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Great point. Let's take one more point from the floor, and then I'd love to hear some responses from the panel.
Yeah, yes, hello. I think that this will resonate with the previous two comments. My name is Stephen Muldrum. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and I do field work with HIV and LGBTQ health organizations based in Atlanta, local organizations, not the CDC. And I have questions about basically what happens when and how do activists respond when the folks who were the activists doing the radical things back in the day become part of the institutional apparatus of the response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I mean, what I found is a lot of these historic AIDS service organizations and folks who will identify as activists or people who do activist work are actually really just engaged in the provision of social services, and that a lot of times activism by people in that group, and by no means all of these folks, but their quote unquote demands will be to restore funding to their organization for a program or to.
We're not deliberately cutting you off. Keep going. Great. Thank you. I see other people wanting to talk, but we older activists start to forget things. So let's answer a few of those questions. And I'm afraid, Kate, you're the obvious person to look to in a question of what happens when the activists join the bureaucracy. But I think we've got three kind of overlapping questions. It's all about transitions through time, isn't it? I mean, what's the intergenerationality? How are older and younger activists learning from each other and appreciating each other, and how do we tackle these questions of intersectionality? But let's start with what happens when you join the House after you've been the activist on the outside.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks for the questions. So a few things that are just coming to the top of my head. And first of all, as we were talking, I was thinking back to when I and others here, I think, started, got involved in the mid-'80s or whenever it was, and we were actually young people then as well. We didn't define ourselves as young people. We were just doing what needed to be done, and I think that if you ask me now what needs to be done moving forward, I actually don't have a clue, because whatever I think is pretty much redundant now. I have no idea about the real lives and the experiences of people who are 30 years or 40 years younger than me. So I do agree. I mean, I think one of the problems has sometimes been that we haven't necessarily always managed to make the space that's needed for new ideas and new generations to come in and take over. The question around UHC and looking at the broader intersectionalities, I mean, first of all, Ben, yeah, I really agree with what you say in terms of how in '96 something shifted. And I think something really did shift because it became much more of an us and them situation. While before there had been many of us who, from the north, who had access to basic medications and medication for opportunistic infections. At the end of the day, there was nothing that was keeping us alive in the long term. But that shifted in 1996, and I think. Therefore, the activism changed because it was also about a solidarity. It was about the outrage that we were. I was seeing my friends in Africa and other parts of the world continuing to die while I wasn't, and that was it was unbearable. Like you felt like you needed to do something. But I think a legacy of that has been the re-biomedicalization of HIV. And we see that in funding. We see that where I work in the Global Fund. If you look at where we're at now in terms of funding, what we're funding, the percentage that we're funding for prevention has dropped dramatically as treatment is scaled up, and yet funds don't increase. So I think it's a big question for all of us. How do we somehow regain that balance and also regain the value and in terms of funding decisions for some of these broader issues that Vu and others were talking about. I think in terms of the UHC agenda, what a lot of the work that I've been involved in over the last couple of years has really been about trying to link up within the context of UHC, looking at it from the lens of marginalisation and who's being left behind. And what we've done, I think, and learned well within HIV has been that coalition building across, those who are being left behind, whether it's sex workers or trans people, gay men, migrants, refugees, so on, And I think expanding that as we move forward, within the context of broader health is something that is going to be really critical, because it is about building those bridges but finding that commonality. And I think unless we do that, we run the risk of HIV not having enough, receiving enough focus, but also every marginalised group not having the focus. I think there's a lot that we've learned from HIV that can be that can be taken to the broader health environment, and in terms of the JIPA principle. And I see people in the room who were there in Paris in 1994 when that was, when that was actually developed and signed off by governments. But that nothing, the greater involvement of people living with HIV, nothing about us without us, that needs to be really embedded in the whole of the UHC response. And I'll stop there, I think.
Thanks. I think we should turn to Eric as the other one who's gone from activist to bureaucrat. Tell us a bit about your reactions to those three questions, the intergenerational bit in particular.
Well, I don't know if I'll take them in the same order, but just in a response to your comments about, service providers that started as activist organizations that sold out and refused to challenge drug companies, for example, around things like, and a lot of my comments will be about the cost of Truvada and PrEP, and there's now a Break the Patent organization to try to break the patent on Truvada, and I'll come to why that exists. But I think you need to hold those organizations accountable, and you need to call those people out who are maybe selling their souls to maintaining the organizations that provide services, but you also need to realize that the services that are provided by organizations are really crucial and important, and maybe and recognize that maybe those organizations can't be the activists that go forward and call Gilead and other drug companies genocidal profiteers, because they do get a lot of funding from those organizations that could be cut off and could end the provision of valuable services. I'll come back to the break the patent thing in a minute, but I think what has changed is that back in '92 we didn't have an effective treatment that would keep us alive. Many places didn't have human rights protections. Stigma was really off the charts, and people were fired from their jobs, evicted from apartments, thrown out of restaurants. I mean, the list went on and on. Eventually that shifted to a degree in the North for rich countries, but it's never shifted globally in an equitable and a just way. And what's enraging to me is that we have the tools that could end the epidemic. We have information, we have treatments, we have effective prevention techniques. Now with treatment as prevention, U equals U, PrEP, PEP, we have the ability to stop the epidemic in its tracks, but we're not universally and with justice rolling out those tools around the world. And so poor people in the U.S. continue to die, just like poor people in Africa and the Caribbean and Eastern Europe continue to die. It's also because of criminalization of HIV that makes no sense, especially now that we have treatment as prevention and U equals U. And so a lot of our fighting has to continue to turn to address the lack of human rights, the stigmatization, the criminalization, and the ridiculous profiteering of drug companies on drug costs. The Break the Patent group around the cost of Truvada is, an initiative that has largely been launched by young people, mainly in the U.S., but it's a growing movement. And they're targeting Gilead because Truvada was developed primarily on public funds. 5 of the patents for parts of the chemicals of Truvada were paid for on U.S. government grants done by the National Institute of Health. And generic Truvada costs $6 a day. A month. $6 a month in the developing world. That's $72 a year. It costs $1,500 a month in the U.S., $18,000 a year for PrEP in the U.S., a really effective prevention tool. And why? It's produced obviously for less than $6 a month. Why is Gilead getting away with this? That patent, which has been extended needs to be broken, and it's not going to happen. I mean, we took that issue of patented drugs and demanded generic production of HIV medications, 15 or more years ago, and we got the Indian drug companies like Cipla to produce generic HIV medications, and those drugs expanded to a large degree around the world, but still only 60% of people have those drugs. Gilead has made more than $82 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars, $82 billion on this drug. And they did not do most of the research. And the government research cost less than $100 million. And they're allowed to profiteer to that degree. It's insane. So activists in New York, young people at the AIDS Memorial in New York City, set up recently, just last week, a PrEP clinic for generic PrEP. And they dressed the memorial in blue vinyl, the color of the PrEP pill. They turned the fountain in the middle to look like a blue pill. And they created something they called International HIV Prevention Day, that all of its focus was on that patent and getting access to generic PrEP. And they, pretended to be seeing patients to give out the pills, and they took to social media. They were trending as number 2 or number 4 all day long from launching that campaign at 9 in the morning until 5 at night. And so that embarrassed the hell out of Gilead on a global basis, using an action done by young people, conceived by young people, using new techniques. And those are the types of things that we still have to do. Last year in the fight against Trump Care and to protect Obamacare, myself, a whole bunch of people got arrested dozens of times in Congress to put pressure on the government to try to block Obamacare from being rolled back. Those types of tactics still need to happen in places where they can happen by activists that can do it without the risk of being thrown in jail or murdered by their police or repressive regimes or government or companies in their countries. But the key is we know what to do. We all have to invest and make a commitment to do what we can do at whatever level we can, and to network with other people to try to get these problems that are the same old problems addressed.
Thank you. So, Shanine, there was a very strong call from the floor to have young leaders at the front and for us older activists to listen a bit harder to youth leadership. What are your reflections on some of the questions from the floor and some of the things you've heard from other panelists?
All right, yes. I like the comment from one of who is inside there, that we should also involve young peers. And as we are young peers and young people, activism which was done before, there are things which were there which affected. And in 1992, I cannot imagine what happened there. But I'm glad that the activists who stood up and also stood up for our rights to be heard and also for us to access the treatment, even though the medicine is not adequate enough, even though the services are not adequate enough, but I'm very grateful for that. So my proposition, what I'm thinking and suggesting is we should also connect, as the panelist is saying, we should connect with other connections, and we are focusing on one goal so that we can reach an HIV-free generation out there. And also we should also empower young peers and also dig deep down and see which groups are being suppressed, the voices which are being suppressed, and make them being and dug out there. The key populations who are being suppressed, there are so many LGBTQI people who inject drugs and also who are abused out there, and also young people living with HIV are out there. We should empower them so that they can stand up and raise their voices and make connections so that or the time we reach 2020, we would stand up and also we would review and bring what we have brought in front and not be ashamed and embarrassed that we couldn't do this and that. Even though financial systems are lagging behind us, but there are connections out there. We should also pressure through the policymakers and also those funders who are funding us to let them know and also know that in their minds, these things need to be done by a targeted year, and also we should pressurize them that they should also know and implement these things and change what is needed to be done, not rather than saying we will do it later, we would do that and having this, and also we would do that later, and also crashing the voices down. But we should let them know that it is important that we reach these services to the people out there, and also the voices of those people who are being suppressed are heard and everything is being implemented, so that during when we reach the 1990, we are there to tell them that we have done this, and all the connections and all the young people out there and all the key population groups are heard. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Diego, can we turn to you as well for some reflections on some of those points? And I don't know, but I feel like I want to say before I do that, you know, many of us were young activists at the time, and I was reflecting as I was listening to you about the fact that She Decides has recently elected our first chair. Oh, she's been appointed, and she's a 28-year-old young woman from Malawi, and we're really proud to be led as older people by a young woman, and it's been quite exciting to watch her going to talk to the ministers who are fellow champions of hers, who are much older and are actually respecting her youth leadership. So I do feel that something is shifting already in the activist space and in our communal space. But Diego, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to share, to our young activists here, because often just as the older activists who got into the systems kind of forgot, maybe might have some of them, that's all, have forgotten where they started or what was their real cause. I think that still happens now. I think especially now when there is so much opportunity for young persons. Many of our younger activists, when they get integrated into systems of government, into international organizations, they tend to stray from where they started and forget the people on the ground. What I say, we must never stop working from the people on the ground. I'm not saying not take those positions, is be up there, but also thinking of how you can support everyone down. Because we will eventually grow, but the issues still remain. There are still things that need to be done. Issues of criminalization. In a lot of our developing countries, women are still being abused. Young women, young women are still being raped and being infected with HIV. Child marriage. There is HIV criminalization in a lot of countries, and we must remember these people on the ground that need the support from us. So when we are here in these global spaces, we are not representing us. We must network with our older folks, because a lot of times what happens is that we younger folks then, and I can say, we tend to bash on older folks and what they did for us. Because there is this disconnect between the younger activists and the old. There's no memoirs there to say how this started. It's all dying with the people that are going with this. So we need to bridge that gap and really sit down together as both as old and young and see how we can address these issues affecting in order to reach the 1990 and all of the global targets. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Diego. I like the plea not to bash the old activists too much. Will, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm looking back and looking forward, one of the things that's exciting me most about the activism that I'm involved in right now in the UK is about how intersectional it is. It is about how we are working across generations. And as someone who had moved away from frontline activism for the best part of a decade and is now right back in the heart of it, one of the things that thrills me the most is showing up at meetings and events and it being chock full of young people, of trans people, of people of color, of sex workers, as well as those of us who are older. And I look back 25, 26 years ago to being here, and there are a whole set of older people who I am hugely grateful for how they mentored me, how they influenced me, how they showed me the paths. But I'm also really grateful that they were able to listen to me as a younger activist about how I thought we should do things differently. I've recently been fairly critical of some of the approaches that we used in 92 and 93. I've also been fairly critical. If you look at Hello Gorgeous conference special, I have also been fairly critical fairly recently of some of the recent actions against Gilead, and I think we should do actions against Gilead. But I thought some of the newer actions against Gilead in the UK quite recently have been bad activism and not smart activism. But I'm actually thrilled by what we're seeing. I think it's more intergenerational than I've ever seen it. And one of the things for us older activists to think about is if we want a newer generation of activists to join us, it needs to be relevant. And I think some of the stuff we're seeing about U equals U and PrEP is making HIV activism relevant again. It's making it exciting, it's making it tangible, and it's making it international as well.
Great points. Rebecca.
Yeah, I also want to agree with the last speaker that I think, if you look at the activists that were there who led Treatment Action Campaign, Zaki is now taking on issues on land justice and making connections on land justice around equality and human rights. Mark Haywood is looking at education and healthcare in South Africa. So I'm thinking, I think we have to accept that not all of us in the AIDS movement will be able to find a home for some of the things that we think we need to branch out and really push on. But some of us must find a home within the AIDS movement. I have found a home on gender justice and raising women's rights issues within the AIDS movement because it's so closely associated. And forcing the space to really, really be intentional and not by accident to be intersectional. And I think we have begun that. We've even begun to even shift the language that we are using. When we say women, why should we not intersectionalize even women? Because women is not just this and that. Women, there's a big group of women, and it's educational. Even for me, I was 21 when I joined the AIDS movement. I knew nothing about AIDS drugs. I knew nothing about how to challenge drug companies. I learned all of those things here. And those tools that we learned then, I'm using them now on women's rights. I'm using those tools on gender justice because I think we had enough knowledge on what to do and how not to do. But I also agree with the fact that I think we have to be smarter today because I think we've kind of become much more predictable that the minister knows you are going to march, so it's like that effect when someone smiles when you are marching and you feel like they should be angry, but they're not angry because they know you are going to march and they're expecting it. An element of surprise and learning more ways from Diego and you that how can we best, do this smarter and make it much more today's activism, plus a combination of the old ways of doing it. But also, it's okay to self-critique ourselves. It's fine to say, I actually don't think you should have done that. We have been accused of being noise activists. And I think that comes from a place where people are saying, we march too much, but we're actually not offering much solutions. But sometimes we offer solutions, we are not being heard because of the way in which we deliver. And we think that in all spaces we can only be heard only by protesting. In some spaces we are not going to be heard only by, in academia you can cry all you want. You need to provide evidence and you need to present it in the conferences where that evidence is going to be heard. Those are some of the examples that I think I am learning. I am extremely impatient with myself. Very impatient, because unfortunately, not all spaces will take a confrontation easy, but confrontation through evidence can also work, because you're actually putting out the issues in a different way, but not necessarily matching. But I also would like to still do all the things. I have suddenly found Twitter in 2011. I didn't know how to tweet before 2011. I am now a Twitter fanatic. I tweet like nothing. And I know that now I can tag my president. I didn't know that before 2011. Facebook is also a new thing. So we are catching up. And we are trying to use, but we are also a generation that is not used to writing things in one sentence. We are a generation that wants to make the argument very clear. You must be left with no question that I did not address all your questions. Twitter wants you to do how many characters? And it's difficult. It's not easy, but it works for certain type of activism. That too, young people also have to understand that even Twitter will not solve our problems, because there are other MPs who are not going to understand one sentence. What do you mean? They want you to explain, and you therefore have to send a letter. You have to do a petition. You have to go and lobby. You have to go and have a nice meeting. Even though you don't like that minister, you have to go and have. So we need those combinations. And I appreciate young people, and I appreciate old. Well, we call you dinosaurs these days. I don't know whether that's good. I am in the middle, and I'm young. Consider me as one of you. Because I think these dudes are too, yeah, not me.
I just lost my friendship with you. Now, I could sit here for hours and hours and hours and talk about activism. I do recognize there's one person who was standing at the back trying to make a point earlier. If she would like to make the point now, and one from you, but I would ask you to keep it brief in case we get kicked out the room. Please go ahead.
I'll certainly keep it brief. Thank you very much for sharing all your stories. And my question revolves around people living with special needs, both challenge and physical. I haven't heard you reflecting in your activism how you've actually incorporated or integrated or made sure that, people who are living with special needs are actually being catered for. So can you please maybe reflect on it, or maybe if you have any plans going forward, and share with us your experiences then and now, or maybe future.
Thank you. It's a good point. And you had a comment as well, or a question, please? You, sitting in the front row, please.
My name is Gennady Rashubkin. I'm from Ukraine. And first of all, I want to say great thank to all of you for sharing your memories and ideas, and great thank for everything you did, and I hope will do. To me, activism is a kind of immune system of the society, and now we are discussing how to keep our immune system in a good health. You've discussed the difference between activists 30 years ago and now, and I guess one of the main issues has to be addressed in our discussion is that the modern activist cannot be just a passionate person. Because 30 years ago it was quite enough to stand and stand the message that I demand to save my life. Now we're talking about huge variety of enablers and many other ideas, social, medical, biomedical, etc., and people who 30 years ago was very clear with what we are offering, and what we're fighting for, now can be confused with all this science, political, and etc. stuff we are operating with. So we have to be educated, and this is the main difference, because we cannot be only passionate now. The modern activist is less knight saving life, it is more consultant, supporter, and expert. This, from my point of view, the main difference between 30 years and now. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have time to go back through the panel, but just in saying a few closing remarks, I'll try and pick up a couple of those points. Because the question for this session was, what types of activism are needed 30 years into the AIDS response? And I wrote down quite early on in this session, smart, sassy, sexy activism. Because I think in different ways, you've all been talking about different ways in which people are smart. And I think some really important points have just been raised, particularly towards the end of the session, but I think we've heard it throughout, around intersectionality. And I think many of us older activists would say a lot of those questions were there from the beginning, that we always were working across a variety of issues, just the ways, for example, you picked up housing very early on in the HIV movement in New York. But I think what's coming so much more to the fore now is the concept of intersectionality and the concept of connectedness. And of course, what we're connecting across is constantly changing and evolving. And I think that's come through as a very strong message. And our diversity is our strength, not just our diversity of types of people and the diversity of our global connectedness, but also the diversity across our issues. So a really important reminder to us all to hold that. And of course, this spectacularly important point about learning from each other and this intergenerationality. And we haven't spoken much about it, but I think the mentorship that many of us experienced when we were younger activists, and that we have an obligation to provide so that we can foster that smart activism that doesn't keep on repeating things that we know either work or don't work in dysfunctional ways. You spoke as well just now about disability, and I'd say from the early days of HIV, actually disability issues were quite central, often because at the beginning of the epidemic they might have been linked to the opportunistic infections, and we were often dealing very directly with comrades and friends who were struggling with a range of physical disabilities and indeed mental health challenges, dementia and so forth, were day-to-day realities for us in the early days. I was reflecting on the fact that on Valentine's Day 1989 we convened a conference on disability and sex, which terrified the people I was working with a bunch of amazing people with physical disabilities wanting to talk in a very lively way about sex and sexuality. But I think that maybe does speak to our intersectionality and how do we make these things more visible in what we do. You've also talked a lot about different techniques, like Vueseka, I've had to learn to tweet. But also, you know, the range of ways in which the arts are important to us, the fact that your video is so moving and important to us. So thinking about how we learn those different techniques. And I think the point that you made actually quite early on, Will, about academics can be activists, and indeed bureaucrats can be activists, doctors can be activists, scientists can be activists. Jonathan Mann, who brought the conference here, was a doctor and a human rights thinker and a bureaucrat at a very senior level in WHO, and he was going to stand up to the US government as much as everyone else. What else in terms of smart, sassy, sexy activism? Well, I'd say the attack on repressive policies, whether it's repressive state policies that we've heard about, and I do want to give a shout out to the Global Gag Rule, which is what sparked She Decides, the support unit that I'm co-leading at the moment. And that is another US state policy which is killing people by preventing women and girls around the world from getting access to abortion and to the range of sexual and reproductive justice that they require. But smart activism is about attacking all of these policies, all of these laws, wherever they occur. I think the other thing that you've really emphasized in a lot of your comments is this whole point about nothing about us without us. And whether that's about positive people being at the center of activism, or about young people being at the center of activism, about people wanting to access PrEP being the center of their activism, it's about knowing what we need and making it clear and making it visible. So it's been an incredibly rich session. I want again to thank Gabby Patterson and Will Nutland for bringing the video to us. I also very much want to thank Joe Manchester and Jane Shepherd for sharing some of the slides that have been running behind us. And I especially want to thank all of you for your attention and your vibrant questions, and the brilliant panelists, Diego, Kate, Vueseka, Eric, Will and Shanine. It's been an absolute pleasure spending the afternoon with you. Enjoy your conference.